Darkness had always been a part of the city where Mason lived. Power outages happened so often that he no longer flinched when the streetlights flickered until everything plunged into complete darkness. But that night, as he walked through the streets with sparse lights and not a soul in sight, the darkness felt different. This was the place he had lived in, a place that reflected the life he had experienced over the years. He stepped into his house and slowly opened the door, the familiar creak echoing through the empty space. The silence was only broken by the howling wind outside. The living room was as it always was, an old chair, a slightly off-center table. Everything was still, everything was familiar, just like any other day. As Mason entered, a sharp crack echoed through the rooms, followed by the low hum of electronics powering back on. The lights flickered a few times before staying on, illuminating the house in a cold, uncomfortable glow. The house, which moments ago felt like an endless void, was now exposed under the sudden light, as if the electricity had brought forth an unavoidable truth. He pulled an old stool from the kitchen and sat down for a moment. He didn't try to get comfortable, he just sat there, resting his chin on his hand, leaning forward, staring into the empty void. A feeling had been growing inside him over the years. There was a time when this house had been full of life, Elena's laughter echoing through the rooms, the kids' clumsy footsteps as they ran around, and the delicious smell of the dinners Elena meticulously prepared. But now, the house was just an empty shell, devoid of laughter, a place where people lived together but no longer belonged to each other. Their marriage had become a prolonged silence, filled with unspoken words. Time had pushed them apart, or perhaps they had let it happen. He didn't know anymore. What he did know was that Elena had changed. For months, her gaze had been distant, her touch less present, her words more guarded, as if she were hiding something she didn't want to reveal. Little things started to bother him, but he ignored them, the late-night messages she'd rush out of the room to answer, the smiles that followed her replies. None of it was big enough to confront her about, but pieced together, they painted a troubling picture. And then that night, something finally set off an alarm in him. Elena was different. She was dressed up, taking care of every detail, her body, her hair, her clothes. It wasn't that he didn't want her to look good, but he knew it wasn't for him. He could feel it as she came down the stairs in a fitted red dress, wearing lipstick he hadn't seen in years, and a perfume he'd never smelled before. Something twisted inside him. He tried to act like he didn't notice, tried to smile as if everything was fine, but the questions slipped out before he could stop them. Is this party just for employees? She paused for a second, a little longer than usual, then brushed her hair back, grabbed her purse, and smiled. Yeah, just for employees. He nodded slowly, pretending to believe her. Can I come with you? Elena let out a short laugh. Mason, it's a company party. You don't know anyone there, you'd be bored. And with that, she walked out, leaving Mason staring blankly. He watched her leave in a hurry, not even glancing back. The sound of her heels echoed down the hall, and the door closed softly behind her. He stayed seated. Time passed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him was breaking. He took a deep breath, stood up slowly, and went to the bedroom. He put on a simple outfit, slipped on his shoes, and looked at himself in the mirror. There was no anger, no panic, just a need to know the truth. Without another thought, he grabbed his car keys and headed to the party. The venue's facade was impressive, with large glass windows reflecting the city's bright lights. The parking lot was packed, elegant guests coming and going with drinks in hand, laughter floating through the air, lively chatter all around. It was a celebration for everyone else, but for Mason, there was nothing to celebrate. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his tie, and took a deep breath. He didn't know exactly what he expected, but something inside told him he had to see for himself. It was the instinct of a man who had ignored too many signs for too long. As he walked through the glass doors, he was greeted by a lavish, extravagant scene. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting golden light onto intricately decorated walls. Soft instrumental music blended with the murmurs of the crowd. Mason moved slowly, taking in every detail. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Elena's familiar figure. He quietly made his way to the bar and ordered a whiskey. As the golden liquid filled the glass, he sensed a presence nearby. A group of executives was chatting animatedly, discussing the company and future plans. Then he heard something that made him freeze. David has big plans for Elena. He's grooming her for a higher position, a well-dressed man said with the confidence of someone who knew more than he should. The others chuckled, as if there was an inside joke only they understood. Mason felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just the words, but the tone, the way they were said, as if there was something about this promotion everyone knew. He kept his face expressionless, holding the glass but not drinking, pretending not to care, but his mind was spinning. He was gripped by the sense that something was deeply wrong, a quiet alarm ringing inside him. He needed to find her now. He slowly set the glass down and started walking. The main hall was vast, but Mason knew if Elena was up to something, she wouldn't be in the middle of the crowd for all to see. So he began searching the quieter, less traveled hallways. As he moved away from the party, the noise faded. The music grew distant, the chatter reduced to a soft hum. The carpet muffled his footsteps as he passed closed doors, some slightly ajar, rooms meant for meetings or more private gatherings. His heart pounded, but he refused to rush. With each step, the feeling grew stronger that he was about to witness something that would change everything. He passed a group of employees whispering in a corner, one glancing at another as they saw him, a look that said more than words. He kept going, entering a darker hallway lined with closed doors. And then he saw her. Elena, her back to him, standing next to David. She held a glass of wine, her posture relaxed as if their closeness was perfectly normal. She leaned toward him slightly, as if she'd forgotten there was a husband in the picture. Mason didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just watched. David smiled faintly, touching her arm, and she didn't flinch. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, but not to Mason. He knew his wife. He knew that look. He knew how she acted, how she moved with him, and in that moment, he knew Elena wasn't there just for work. Mason stood still, hidden in the dim light of the hallway, watching the scene unfold. David leaned closer to Elena, whispering something that made her smile, a smile Mason hadn't seen in years, free and intimate. Before he could fully process it, David gently cupped her face, his fingers brushing her skin with a familiarity that was too much, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a hesitant kiss, not a moment of doubt. It was something they both clearly expected. Elena didn't pull back or act surprised. Instead, she closed her eyes and let it happen, as if she'd walked this path many times before. And in that instant, something inside Mason shattered. His pulse raced, but the air left him, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that took over his body. His hands trembled, not from anger, but from certainty. Without taking his eyes off them, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and quietly opened the camera. If this was what Elena wanted, then this was what she'd get. His phone screen captured it all, the kiss, the surrender, the betrayal unfolding before him. He held it steady, ensuring the footage was clear. He didn't need words, didn't need excuses, just clarity. And he'd hold on to that truth until the right moment. His mind tried to make sense of it, to find an explanation, but there was no room for excuses. If only she'd hesitated, if there'd been a hint of guilt, a second of doubt, the smallest sign of respect for their family. But no, Elena had given in. She embraced it, and that hurt more than any physical betrayal ever could. Mason couldn't remember the last time she'd kissed him like that. He couldn't recall the last time she'd looked at him the way she was looking at David now. He'd lost this battle long before he realized he was fighting it. His hands clenched into fists. The urge to storm in, yank David away, demand in front of everyone how long this had been going on, to explode like a bolt of lightning. It passed because Mason was never one for a scene. He took a deep breath, letting himself feel every second of it, letting the pain burn but not control him. Then he stepped back, one step, then another. He turned and walked away from the shadowed hallway, leaving without them noticing. They were too preoccupied to see him. On his way back to the party, the music filled his ears again. Laughter and the clinking of glasses surrounded him once more. It was as if nothing had happened, as if his world hadn't just collapsed. He moved through the crowd unhurriedly, expressionless, showing no outward sign of rage. But inside, a decision had been made. He didn't plan to confront her that night. No shouting, no arguing, no witnesses. There would be an end, and it would be on his terms. He quietly exited, got into his car, and shut the door with a sharp click. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. His face was unreadable, but his eyes said it all. No fiery rage, no blind hatred, just a cold, sharp silence and a resolve. He drove back through the quiet streets, lit by streetlights like beacons on a road with no return. When he finally parked in front of the house, he sat in the car for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of everything he now knew. The power had come back on before he left, still lighting the house, but inside him, everything was dark. He opened the door and stepped inside. Everything was as he'd left it, a cold, silent, lifeless space. For the first time, he saw the house for what it was, not a home, but a stage for an empty marriage, sustained only by habit. Without hesitation, he went to the study cabinet, pulled out a folder, and opened it on the table. The divorce papers had been there for a while, drafted back when Elena still pretended to care, when they both had the energy to act like something could be saved. But like everything else in their lives, the papers had been forgotten in the chaos. Now, there was no need for further discussion. He took out his phone, opened the gallery, and pulled up the video from the party. It was still there, intact, clear, undeniable. Without taking his eyes off the screen, he hit share and attached it to a message. A parting gift. Without a word, he sent it to Elena's number. Then he picked up the folder, set it on the living room table, and left the divorce papers open beside it. He placed the small velvet box he'd kept since the day he proposed, a full circle right before his eyes. All that was left was for her to sign. Mason didn't go to bed. He didn't want to see her come home and pretend nothing had happened. He didn't want to hear lies, excuses, or justifications. He'd seen all the truth he needed. Half an hour later, the screech of tires outside broke the night's silence. Mason sat still, unmoving, waiting. Elena burst into the house. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smudged, her eyes wide. She clutched her phone, her hand shaking as she gripped it, the screen's light illuminating her pale face. She looked like she'd run the whole way, probably leaving the party the moment she saw the message. Panic was etched into every line of her face. Mason remained in his chair, still, cold, unshaken. He didn't need to ask anything. She knew exactly what he'd seen at the party. "Mason," she said, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper, desperate. "It's not what you think." Mason didn't bother responding, ignoring her words entirely. He just tilted his head slightly, as if waiting to see how far she'd take the lie. I can explain," she said, stepping closer, still holding the phone as if she could erase what had happened, as if she could undo the truth he'd witnessed. Mason let out a low, hollow, humorless laugh, devoid of emotion. "Explain?" he finally spoke, crossing his arms. "Explain what? That wasn't you. That wasn't your boss. That kiss never happened." Elena opened her mouth but no words came out. The weight of the truth was an impenetrable wall. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Mason stood up, but not with aggression. His movements were deliberate, like a man who had settled on his choice. He walked to the table, picked up the folder, and placed it gently in front of her. "I've got everything ready," he said, his voice calm, cold, uncompromising. "All you need to do is sign." Elena's eyes darted from the papers to him, desperation plain on her face. "Mason, please." "It was just a mistake," her voice trembled. "Yeah, it was a mistake," he said, stepping back, his gaze locked on hers. "And now you'll live with the consequences." She shook her head, panic rising like wildfire. She'd expected yelling, rage, or him slamming doors. But no, his contempt cut deeper than any emotional outburst could. "This isn't fair," she tried to say, her voice breaking. "You're going to ruin everything over one moment." Mason blinked slowly, as if that was the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. The silence that followed sliced like a blade through her heart. She stood there, frozen, defeated, consumed by her own shame. Mason grabbed his keys from the table and headed for the door. He didn't look back. "I'll be back tomorrow for my things," he said. And with that, he left. He didn't give her a chance to say anything more. He didn't turn around. Mason was never impulsive, but he also wasn't the type to leave things hanging. The next morning, after sleeping soundly for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Sitting at the kitchen table in a small downtown hotel, his new temporary home, far from the weight of a failed marriage, he took out his phone, opened the gallery, and found the video of the betrayal. He watched it again, but this time there was no pain or anxiety, just the certainty that he was about to close this chapter for good. He opened an email, addressed to the company's CEO. Subject: A necessary clarification. Dear leadership, I hope this email finds you well. As the husband betrayed by one of your senior employees, and knowing this occurred on company property with one of your directors, I'd like to understand if this behavior aligns with the values your company claims to uphold. I believe that before promoting certain individuals, perhaps a closer look at their priorities is in order. Attached is a revealing video. He attached the file, reviewed everything calmly, and sent it without hesitation. Now it was just a matter of time. A response came quickly. That afternoon, David was summoned to a private meeting with the board. Within an hour, he was no longer with the company. His departure was quiet, no public announcement, just a sudden resignation. But everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. Elena's reckoning came slower, but the humiliation was far worse. Once a company star, respected for her position, she found her office cleared out, her responsibilities reduced to a meaningless role. The admiring looks she once received turned to whispers and judgment. She tried to hold her head high, acting like nothing was wrong, but every time she stepped into the elevator and saw people avoid her gaze, she knew there was no escape. That night, in desperation, she called Mason. Once, twice, 10 times. Nothing. Then the messages started, "Please, Mason, we need to talk. I messed up, but it can't end like this. Please pick up." Her desperation grew with each unanswered plea. She was no longer the center of his world, and now she knew what it felt like to be cast aside. But Mason didn't want to hear explanations, didn't want a fight, didn't want her tears. He had everything he needed. Friends asked if he'd gone too far, if it was really necessary to end the marriage over this. Mason just smiled calmly and said, "Would you lend your wife out for a weekend?" The silence that followed was always the answer. He moved on with his life. He started over and didn't need to look back. The kids, who once saw their mother as a role model, sided with their father. They'd known about the affair, had seen the signs, but waited for Mason to figure it out himself. And when he did, there were no more decisions to make. She'd made them for them. Elena tried to plead with them, begging them to take her side, but the emptiness in their eyes hurt more than any harsh words could. "Mom, you made your choice. Now you have to live with it." And with that, she lost everything. Over time, Mason realized that the perfect revenge wasn't shouting, destroying, or holding on to hate. It was simply moving on without looking back. Some pain didn't need a reaction, it just needed an ending. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more videos to come.